Before we get started, a quick heads up. Presidents Unplugged now has merch. If you want to support the show and represent the podcast in your daily life, you can at presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. That is presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. Now, let's get into today's episode. How does one of the toughest, most experienced soldiers in American history die in one of the strangest ways imaginable? Zachary Taylor was a man who survived decades of war, frontier combat, disease, and some of the harshest conditions early America had to offer. Only to die less than 2 years into his presidency after a 4th of July celebration. Cherries and milk. That's the story we're told. Was it just an unfortunate accident? Or was there something more going on? Today we're talking about the life, the presidency, and the mysterious death of America's 12th president, Zachary Taylor. This is Presidents Unplugged. Let's do this. Zachary Taylor was born in 1784 in Virginia, just after the American Revolution. But his family wouldn't stay there for long. They moved west to the Kentucky frontier when Zachary Taylor was just a kid. And this is important because Kentucky at the time was not the Kentucky we think of today. It was the frontier. It was underdeveloped. It was rough. And it was dangerous, and most importantly, they didn't even have fried chicken. This was a post-Revolutionary War America that was still figuring itself out, and the frontier was not a place of comfort. It was a place of survival. Growing up there meant hard work, instability, and constant uncertainty, which trained Taylor to be tough, rough, and ready for anything. His dad actually served in the military, so Taylor grew up all around the ideas of service and duty to this brand new country. From a young age, he knew that he wanted to fight in the United States Army. Taylor then went on to spend over 40 years in the Army, making fighting on the battlefield his entire identity long before politics ever entered his mind. But he wasn't a man that stayed in the military just to climb the ranks and one day, just one day, become a general or something. He stayed in the Army because he knew it was where he was meant to be, and really, what he was good at. Over time, he earned the nickname Old Rough and Ready. And it wasn't a gimmick, because Taylor wasn't like the other generals. Taylor dressed like the soldiers, lived like his soldiers, and fought alongside his soldiers. At the time, most generals would ride on their white horse and watch the people fight abroad. They wouldn't really do too much. And then they would take all the credit. He constantly fought with everything he had. He wasn't really polished, he wasn't refined, and he 100% was not really political. He was a soldier through and through, and that's exactly why people trusted him on the battlefield. Nothing else. But that reputation of his exploded during the Mexican-American War under President James K. Polk. We're going to talk about James K. Polk later, and Polk had a very efficient presidency, highlighted by the successes of the Mexican-American War. Taylor's victories in this war, especially at the Buena Vista, turned him into a national hero. He became known larger than life, bigger than anyone else, one of the most powerful generals there was. But here's the thing, Taylor didn't really seek the attention, but it found him anyway. James K. Polk and the Democratic Party had a very successful 4 years. So the other major party, the Whig Party, knew they'd need to make a killer selection to have any chance at the presidency. So they found themselves asking a question, who do we run as our candidate? The answer that they landed on wasn't really a politician or a statesman or somebody who knew what they really believed in. Zachary Taylor. Taylor himself really questioned the decision. He had no political experience. He had never been a governor. He never served in Congress. He didn't have the normal resume of a presidential candidate. He was just in the military. And through the course of history, we've had presidents who have never necessarily served in politics before becoming president. The main three I think of are Zachary Taylor, Dwight Eisenhower, and Donald Trump. It just kind of happens that way sometimes, especially with popularity, because unbelievably, popularity wins elections, and even if they don't know 100% what they politically believe in, America chooses. So they elected him as their candidate, not because of strong party loyalty, but because he was popular. That popularity carried him through the election of 1848, where Taylor defeated Democrat Lewis Cass, and a third candidate in the race was Martin Van Buren. Wait, wasn't he the 8th president? Yeah, Martin Van Buren also ran in this election, trying to be a part of a new party. He tried to make a stellar political comeback and failed miserably. Taylor didn't win because voters understood his policies. Many didn't even really know where he stood on major issues. He won because people knew his name. He won because he was a war hero. Now, on the surface, popularity sounds like a great thing for an elected official. But here's the problem that American history proves to us. Sometimes popularity doesn't mean they're a good politician. And Zachary Taylor, while he tried his hardest, proved that more than anybody. While George Washington himself might not have had an Instagram page, Presidents Unplugged does. If you want to see some presidential content and overall updates on the show, come to the Instagram at presidents_unplugged. See you there. Once he came into the presidential office, his lack of political clarity became really stinking obvious. Taylor didn't really align with either side of the growing sectional divide that I don't know is going to lead into the Civil War, and that made people feel really uneasy of who was running the country. He was a slave owner, a Southern slave owner, which led many Southerners to assume that he would support their interests. But Taylor opposed the expansion of slavery into the new territories acquired after the Mexican-American War. So then big questions were asked. California and New Mexico, they were these new states. Should they be slave states or free states? Well, I mean, Taylor's a slave owner. Of course he's going to expand slavery. What? Taylor believed they should enter the Union as free states? Huh? Taylor also made another decision that was pretty bold at the time. Most of our states, before they were states, were territories. But Taylor did not believe in this territorial phase. He just said, why delay what's already going to happen? Why let it marinate? Just get it done. Okay, California, New Mexico, brand new states. Awesome. Woohoo, expanding the United States. Good for you, Taylor. But this position confused and angered a lot of people. Northerners were really unsure whether to trust him given his background as a Southern slave owner, and the Southerners felt betrayed. Taylor became a walking contradiction. A Southern slave owner who opposed the spread of slavery. A president with almost no strong ideological positions who suddenly took an extremely firm stance on one of the most divisive issues in American history. For the first time in decades, people were more than mad. Serious talk of secession began to emerge. I say secession a lot, and I'm going to say it covering all these 1850s presidents, so I'll remind you. Secession is when a state leaves the Union. Secession would eventually be what 11 states would do during the Civil War, causing what we know as the Union and the Confederates. The idea that states might leave the Union was no longer just a thought in politics. It was becoming a reality. And Taylor's response to this thought was shocking and honestly more bold and more assertive than any president that would come after him until Lincoln. He threatened that any state that attempted to secede would face military force. Zachary Taylor wasn't playing around, but yet again, this is confusing because Americans had seen him as somebody who really didn't take a stance on stuff. And for him to say, yeah, if you secede, I'm sending my people, okay? That was pretty bold. Taylor did not budge. And he also opposed something called the Compromise of 1850, which was being pushed as a solution to calm the tensions. Okay, great, maybe it'll benefit both sides equally, and that's how we're going to calm tensions. But Taylor, knowing the way that things have been working with tensions regarding slavery, he saw right through it. He realized that this compromise largely benefited the expansion of slavery, and if he said yes to it, it could possibly cause greater tension that would eventually lead to the Civil War. It was a very bold take of his to not accept the Compromise of 1850. And even though he personally didn't really want slavery to spread, once again, this angered lots of people. This angered the Southern slave owners that said, yo, you're one of us. What are you doing? These contradictions were one of the many confusing takes on slavery that we would see in the 1850s. Every president during that time had a really different take on it. Some presidents didn't do anything. Some threatened force, but didn't do it. Some just didn't care. I'm talking about you, James Buchanan. And these actions of confusion led the nation to not really trust anybody, which would then directly lead into the Civil War. Taylor seems so strong, he's gonna really leave his mark. Please don't die, Taylor. Oh my gosh, what did I just say? Taylor could never leave his mark on history because his presidency only lasted 16 months, one of the shortest in American history. He wasn't impeached, he wasn't voted out, he died on July 4th, 1850, after attending an Independence Day celebration in Washington. Zachary Taylor became very sick. The story goes that he consumed large amounts of cherries and iced milk on a scorching hot day. Within a few hours, he was suffering severe stomach pain, and 5 days later, he was dead. Now today we hear that and say, he died from eating cherries and milk? Like, that doesn't even make sense. But we have to realize that the 19th century was not like today. They didn't have the Food and Drug Administration. They didn't have people looking at the water to make sure there wasn't 14 different types of worms living in it. It was contaminated. But then it became an issue because This was all around the time that the Compromise of 1850 was a really big debate. This is strange. It almost seems suspicious. For a man who survived decades of war, he had a surprisingly tragic and quick end. And the second after it happened, rumors flooded. Because right after he died, his vice president, Millard Fillmore, who was just a bundle of joy, I promise, came into office and immediately passed the Compromise of 1850. Yeah, that doesn't feel right. And as we know, rumors spread like wildfire. I think he was poisoned. Come on now, Cherries. The ice was contaminated. Did you clean the water in Washington? Yeah, crazy debates. But this mystery didn't linger forever. In 1990, some scientists were pretty curious. How did Taylor die? You know what? Let's solve this. So they did what any great scientist would do, and they dug him up from the ground. They were looking for arsenic, but when they took samples of his hair and nails, the results only showed trace amounts of arsenic, consistent with the environmental exposure at the time. So he wasn't poisoned. The conclusion was clear. Zachary Taylor was not assassinated. He died from illness, and after his death, Vice President Millard Fillmore assumed the presidency and promptly supported that signing of the Compromise of 1850. The issue of slavery was temporarily postponed, not resolved. And I love the way a great presidential historian YouTuber vlogging through history says it. All these people didn't tackle slavery head on. They kicked the can further down the road so somebody would have to deal with it later. The presidents after Taylor continued to kick the can. Fillmore, Pierce, James Buchanan didn't even kick the can. He didn't even know the can was there. And that ultimately led to the Civil War. Zachary Taylor is often remembered more as a general than a president. And that's fair. His presidency wasn't flashy. It wasn't really transformative in American history. He wasn't particularly great, but he also wasn't terrible compared to the people at the time. He was a transitional figure caught between the successes of somebody like James Polk and the failures of the presidents who followed him. His story isn't really about bold leadership or sweeping reforms that he sent throughout the nation. It's about the timing. Sometimes history isn't shaped by what the president does, but what they don't live long enough to finish. He didn't solve America's greatest problem, but he tried not to make it worse. And in the chaos of the 1850s, that may have mattered more than we realize. And that, my friends, is Zachary Taylor. A rough and ready soldier, a reluctant president, and a reminder that even the strongest figures in history can die by something as simple as cherries and milk. And that is why Zachary Taylor is so important. Tune in next Friday as we talk about James Buchanan. From a president who didn't really live long enough to do anything, to a president who had 4 years to do something and still didn't do anything. Not even talking about how this man's negligence directly leads to almost 1 million American deaths during the Civil War. Let's just say James Buchanan's presidency is regarded as one of the worst in history. Why is he the worst? And why did his negligence lead to Abraham Lincoln having to sweep up the mess he had made? Learn about that and much more next week on Presidents Unplugged. I'm Ty Svensson, and I'll see you soon. God bless. We need to make an executive decision now. The executive decision to follow Presidents Unplugged on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today to be notified weekly that your favorite presidential podcast has released new content. Now, let's get back to the show.